Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
I think Bojo has got his mojo back, actually. I've just been talking about this with colleagues, that I think this week we've seen much more the Prime Minister that we know and love.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Chopper to my friends, and this is Chopper's Politics, where once we had left and right, we now have right and, well, centre. Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, this week wrapped himself in a Union Jack and pitched himself as the man who loves his country in a clear bid for the middle ground. But will this talk of community and the importance of family be enough to win back those crucial red wall seats that Jeremy Corbyn lost for Labour last December? On today's show, one of the UK's top pollsters, Deborah Mattinson, will be telling us just that. Plus, former local government minister Simon Clarke will be telling us why he thinks the Tories, his party, have risked too much by drifting to the left as they try and deal with the challenge of the coronavirus pandemic. But first up, there's another party leader about to make his own conference speech this weekend and pitch himself as the man to go back into the middle ground and scoop up the voters there. Sound familiar? The Liberal Democrats. Remember them? Their conference kicks off on Friday. And early this week, Sir Ed Davey, their new leader, and I caught up to discuss his plans about making the Lib Dems back into an electoral fighting force. Ed Davey, welcome to Chopper's Politics. As leader of the Liberal Democrats, congratulations. Well done.
Thank you, Mr. Chopper.
You did OK in the election. You increased seats by maybe 40% to 12. But what is the point of your party at the moment? Why is it required, given how Labour are moving back into the middle ground? I mean, that's where the fight is, and that's where you sit.
I think Britain will always need a liberal party, a progressive party that stands up for both people who need support in life, who need a party with compassion, but also a party that understands people's aspirations and supports business. And I think the Liberal Democrats bring those two things together. And my challenge as leader is, given we've had some pretty disappointing elections, I think we can agree on that, is to make sure that we're listening to voters and we're making our policies more relevant to them. And if we can be relevant to their lives and show how our policies can help them get on in life, but also help them deal with their problems in life and bring together that compassion and that aspiration, now I think we can recover and do far better than we've been doing in recent elections.
In a tweet, what does the Lib Dems stand for?
In a tweet, we stand for helping you and your family get on in life. We stand for caring about your concerns. And that may well mean ensuring you've got a job during this COVID crisis. It may well mean that you need better education for your kids. It may well mean you need more care for your family. Those are sorts of issues, things that are relevant to people's lives that we stand for.
Aren't those things, though, the Tories say they stand for? In fact, exactly those things they stand for, don't they?
Well, look at how they've mismanaged the COVID crisis. They're not on the side of business, it seems. If you look at what they've done with their care homes, I think what happened to our care homes and to carers was a scandal. And I'm both distressed by the horrifying numbers of people who've died, people who've lost loved ones. And I'm quite angry that the government failed and won't even now apologise for the failure, won't even set the public inquiry that I've called for up.
You're going to make caring a key part of your time as leader, aren't you? Because your personal experience with caring for a family member.
It's partly from my personal experience, partly from my experience as a constituency MP. Personally, I was a young carer. My dad died when I was 4. My mum became terminally ill when I was 12, and I nursed her till she died with my brother when I was 15. And then went to live with my grandparents, and my granddad died, and I had to look after my grandmother when she became frail. And now I have a son who's disabled. He can't walk or talk. And my wife and I provide the 24/7 care that he needs. So caring has been a big part of my life. But when I've looked at my constituents who also face challenges, young carers in my constituency, people worried about their elderly relatives in care homes, people who are dealing with mental health problems, I don't think the system works for them because we focus so much on the NHS, qua hospitals and GPs, that the NHS needs a good care system, that social care matters, that carers matter. And without carers, no matter how good the nurses and the doctors are, you need the carers too. And we need to value that caring side.
And we're looking at 14 months since the PM stood on the steps of Number 10 saying that social care would be his big thing to get right, wasn't it?
It's shocking. And what particularly frustrating was that I was around the cabinet table when we managed to get an agreement on care based on NHS principles that were embedded in the Dilnot Commission. And we passed the Care Act, which would have enabled, if the Tories had enacted it properly, would have enabled many more people to get the care they need in an affordable way. Now there are huge numbers of people, because the Tories reneged on that, who aren't getting care. And that's probably not very well known out there. But there was a solution that was legislated for, that was planned for, that was budgeted for, and the Conservatives turned their back on it. And it's a real shame. And now we're here, we are 5 years later, a Prime Minister's promised to deal with it and hasn't done it.
Your comments there, they go to the heart of your problem maybe as leader, that you have to get past your legacy of being in government with the Conservative Party. I'm looking here at They Work For You. It says here that you've almost always voted for a reduction in spending on welfare benefits. I mean, the way Jo Swinson was monstered during the election campaign over her record, you have the same problem, don't you? How will you get past that?
I'll talk about all the really fantastic things that happen thanks to Liberal Democrats alone. So we have really changed the way that people think about mental health. We really changed the way schools think about the more disadvantaged children with our pupil premium policy, making a dramatic difference. We took millions of low paid out of tax. And me personally, I was involved in climate change policy, energy policy, and I oversaw the quadrupling of Britain's renewable power. We're now the world leader in offshore wind. And, George Osborne and Eric Pickles and many other people in the Conservatives tried to stop me. But in government, I won. I took them on and I won. And I delivered on Liberal Democrat policies. And here today, we stand as one of the countries in the industrial world, developed world, that's no longer using coal and getting its carbon emissions down faster than many other countries. That's thanks to Liberal Democrats in government. I will never apologise for tackling climate change. When I started, I had lots of skeptics on the Conservative side who said it was all too expensive, couldn't get down. And, we had certain newspapers, I won't refer to any of them by name, who criticised me and said I was some sort of bunny-hugging crazy guy. As it happens, we are the world leader. How often have you heard someone be able to say that within less than a decade, thanks to their party's policies, you can specifically point to, we have created a world-beating industry. Now, this Prime Minister talks about a world-beating app for COVID. This Prime Minister talks about a world-beating test and trace system. If only. He just doesn't understand business, our Prime Minister.
Well, he's inventing in real time a solution to a pandemic never seen before in the world. I don't want to be a spokesman for the government, but there is that, isn't there? Yeah,
but there are other countries who are doing a lot better. And they're taking a much better approach where they are working with their public health officials. I mean, one of the big problems of this government is it's almost behaving like a Labour government. It's trying to run everything from Whitehall. It's centralising. It's like, this Dominic Cummings NASA mission control with all the data coming into 10 Downing Street and he will sort it all out. I'm sorry, that's not how business runs. That's not how societies run. That's not how communities run. That's not how families run.
Do you detect a degree of arrogance in the way we responded to this crisis because we think the Brits know best, so we tried to invent our own app? That failed. Now we're falling into line with the rest of the world. We're less willing to follow examples in other countries because we're the Brits.
It's not we who failed, it's the government that's failed. I think arrogance is being charitable to them because it's a failure on a grotesque scale. In years gone past, people would have resigned.
Yeah.
People have said, I've failed, this is appalling. People have apologised. People have said, yes, we have to have a public inquiry, as I've called for. But these people, they just don't seem to understand how democracy is supposed to work.
This podcast used to be called Chopper's Brexit Podcast. What's your policy on Brexit? By that, I mean rejoining or not rejoining the European Union.
Well, I'm proudly pro-European and I lead a proudly pro-European party. And we fought the good fight. It's no secret we didn't like Brexit. I think you might have noticed that. But, I'm also telling the party we've got to wake up and smell the coffee. And we've left the European Union, much to my sadness. And now the issue is what's on the table in front of us. And the moment, as we speak, is will the government get a deal or not? Will the deal be any good? Because, by the way, Choppers, I think they'll get a deal. I'm very worried about a no deal, but I sort of think all this stuff about the rule of law, the no deal, it's sort of shroud waving like we saw last time.
Yeah.
And they'll then eventually get a deal and they'll go, oh, isn't it great? We've got a deal.
Yeah.
And I'm all relieved. But the reality is,
I agree with you.
The deal will be a bad deal. A bad deal. And what I want to do is say to them, say to Parliament, say to the country, look, we're pro-European. You got that. You know that about us. And we think a better deal where we can trade more with our nearest neighbours, given we've got this massive economic recession and people's jobs are going, people's businesses are closing. If we can have a better economic relationship with our European neighbours, that's in our country's interest.
That policy will get you through the next 4 or 5 months, maybe. But after that, what is the policy? Will you be fighting the next election on a rejoin ticket? Well,
I just think it's an interesting question, Choppers, but frankly, it's not relevant to where we are today. And I will make the case for cooperating with other countries. I will make a case that that's in our mutual interest, whether it's on trade, the economy.
That's what the government says, though, Ed. They want to cooperate with other countries.
It's not how they behave, though, is it? They say one thing, they do another. That's the problem. They are losing Britain. They are trashing our reputation around the world. They don't seem to understand that threatening to break an international treaty is a disaster for global Britain. You know, Johnson talks about global Britain. Be nice, wouldn't it? But who's going to do a deal with us? With a prime minister who signed a deal, who said to the voters it was a great deal, he said. And a few months later, he's saying it's not a good deal, and he's going to renege on the international treaty he himself designed and signed up to. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And guess what? People around the world are scratching at their heads. They're looking at the UK going, you can't deal with COVID. You can't keep your word on an international deal. What sort of country are you becoming? And he can't blame the Liberal Democrats. He can't blame the Labour Party. He can't blame the British people. There's only one person to blame, and it's looking at him in the mirror.
Are you eyeing up the Labour Party as someone who you can do business with ahead of the next election? It's too early to talk about coupons or deals or whatever, but Keir Starmer is the kind of guy you can do something with, isn't he?
I've just become the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and my focus is on the Liberal Democrats. That's a real surprise to you. And so I'm on this listening tour where I'm going to speak to people around the country. Yeah. I'm going to do it month after month after month because I know we've had a successive poor general election results and the voters have been sending us a message. And so I want to listen to them. I've already begun it. I've done a fish and chip shop visit in Stockport where I did a lunchtime shift for 3 hours and Anne and Bob, who owned it, lovely, lovely people. Jamie, their manager, Dee, who was frying the fish. I've been to South Wales. I went to Cardiff to talk to Greek restaurant owner, a clothes shop owner, a toy shop owner. I went to 2 farms.
Good. You're meeting people. I admire that.
I'm meeting people, and there weren't cameras there. It was all about talking to people and listening to them in particular.
Were they your supporters or were they Tories and other party supporters? The echo chamber is a problem for all parties nowadays. Are you meeting Tories and finding out why they didn't vote for you last December?
I didn't actually ask what their political allegiance were.
That's the key question, surely.
No, it's not actually, because I'm trying to leave politics out of it. You're going beyond Westminster. And what I will tell you, and I'm pretty sure I won't say they represent, I haven't seen enough people yet, but the random sample of people, and it is random, they weren't worried about political allegiances. They didn't talk about politics. It's interesting what they didn't talk about. They didn't talk about things that you and I talk about in the Westminster Law. They talked about their jobs, their businesses, and they're really, really worried about their jobs. And business owners were worried about keeping their business, getting the business to survive, not just for themselves, but from their staff and for their customers and for their community. And they're worried, and it's very early days on the listening tour, but if I bring a message back from the first few visits, it's about there's only one issue in town, and we need to focus on that laser beam-like. We need to sort out the economy, which is in an absolute mess because of this.
Okay.
And unless you sort out the testing system, you won't sort out the economy.
Well, what's your position just finally on these culture wars? People may think it's a kind of Lib Dem obsession for some people. Do you worry that the party may go down a rabbit hole into this kind of culture war row all the time and then miss out on talking to people outside the bubble?
Well, I believe we should stand up for our principles and our values and stand up for people who are marginalised. But I do think we as a party need to recognise that part of the culture war, so-called, is a trap. And it's a trap often laid by people like Dominic Cummings, by people like Donald Trump, who want people who are progressives, who want to stand up for social justice. They want to trap them and distract them from the issues that matter to people. And so, I'm saying to the Liberal Democrats, we will always stand up for marginalised people, and we'll also always stand up for our values. But if we want to win for those values, we've got to win over the trust of the British people. So we've got to speak far more about the things that are on their minds most of the time. What are most people's concerns?
Ed Davey, it's been great to have you on. Best of luck in your time as leader, and best of luck in your tour of meeting Tory voters in the country.
Cheers, Thomas.
Cheers. Right, in just one moment, I'll be talking to Simon Clarke, former government minister, about why he thinks Bojo has got his mojo back. Right after this.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
Right, we're back. With me now is Simon Clarke. Now, he quit earlier this month as a government minister, and since then he's been expressing his concerns very volubly about the government meddling in our everyday lives because of coronavirus. Simon Clarke, welcome to Choppers Politics. Great to have you on.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Good morning.
Now, you've recently left the government for personal reasons, but you are concerned, and you have been concerned, about the direction of travel of the government in terms of the lockdown. I mean, if you shut your eyes, do you sometimes wonder, is this really a Conservative government?
Well, I think this has been a very good week in terms of striking a proportionate balance in terms of lockdown measures. I was concerned early in the week about some of what was being talked about and the threat of what I would describe as lockdown 2.0. Or something so closely approximating a lockdown as to be indistinguishable. And I do believe very strongly that as a Conservative government, and we do believe clearly in individual freedom, that it's important that we respect that proportionate balance when it comes to the interventions that we make during this pandemic. Nobody disputes that the government faces a series of very unenviable choices, and nobody disputes that the data does look much more serious than it did just a few weeks ago. But we do need to keep fighting for a measure of individual freedom, and that's what the government has preserved this week, in fairness to all concerned.
There's talk in Thursday's Telegraph, which I wrote the story, I know more about it, about a traffic light lockdown scheme to avoid shutting down whole swathes of the country when, so obviously, why close down Padstow if Luton is a problem? Do you know what I mean? So this idea of granular level lockdowns looks like a way of trying to get through the winter.
That must be right, I think. And certainly in my conversations with ministers, both when I was in government and since, I know that is their firm focus, to continue to have local lockdowns to tackle outbreaks where they materialise and pose real concern. But for as much of the rest of the country to continue to live with as much comparative normality as possible. I'm certainly not among those arguing that we should not have lockdown restrictions. It's vitally important that we obviously follow the restrictions that have been put in place. They're there for a good reason. I just don't want to see whole swathes of the economy completely closed, and nor do I want to see people unable to see their loved ones. And it's just about maintaining that basic core freedom, even while obviously trying to curb the spread of the virus.
Now, we're speaking ahead of Rishi Sunak's statement to the House of Commons at 12:30 on Thursday. We know the reports say they're going to have wage subsidies to replace furlough. He's delayed the budget. Do you worry who's going to pay for all this? I think back to the last election and the magic money tree, or the last but one, with Theresa May describing Labour policies as a magic money tree. Well, surely you've found not a tree, but a bloody orchard.
Well, it's vitally important that we protect jobs. I mean, the economic and social consequences of truly mass unemployment on the scale that would otherwise be taking place is justification, I think, for extraordinary fiscal measures and extraordinary interventions in the labour market. Nobody on our side of the House went into politics to do this, least of all the Chancellor or the Prime Minister. But actually, I think it's a vindication of the stance we adopted over the course of the last decade that we had to get the public finances back under control so that we, to use Osborne's phrase, fixed the roof while the sun was shining. Now, no one could have dreamt of the storm that was to break, could they?
But the risk is, what's going to pay for it? Will it be tax rises for your core voters, the middle classes? Or will it be more borrowing, gambling on low interest rates?
Well, in the end, that's a decision which only the Chancellor can take in the circumstances that apply at the time when repayment will need to be seriously considered. There is no question that we must maintain fiscal discipline. I think that is absolutely what the Conservative Party is about. It's why people have put their trust in us now at 4 successive elections. It is absolutely imperative that if there are difficult decisions to be taken, that we take them rather than doing what obviously the likes of Gordon Brown and co did in the previous governments and effectively defer them for another day, which would have left us, I fear, even worse off than we are going to be now had that policy continued.
Do you think in any sense the government has got the balance wrong in terms of individual freedom? I mean, there are some Conservatives I speak to who think that it should be up to individuals to manage their own risk. So if you have an elderly parent at home, you don't go out, you do wear a mask, you do keep your distance. If you're in a house of young people, you don't. Don't you think it should be on the individual to manage their risk rather than the state impose their rules on everyone?
Well, we absolutely must take individual responsibility. And clearly, my instinctive philosophical outlook is that people should take as much responsibility as possible for their own lives. However, I do believe actually that the balance as it stands today is appropriate. I was worried earlier in the week that we might be heading towards a situation more analogous to that now seen in Scotland, which I would not welcome, which I think is a very interventionist stance at this stage of the pandemic. I think, however, that what the Prime Minister announced on Tuesday is proportionate. It does preserve that measure of core freedom to continue with the economy, to continue with our family and social lives, while respecting the fact that obviously we're in the teeth of a very serious situation.
Did you think we can see the difference between socialism and where the Tories stand in Scotland, the way that Scotland appears to be much more of an interventionist reaction to this virus outbreak, and perhaps we're now seeing a bit of clear blue water?
I think so. I mean, that would be my reaction to what we're seeing here, that the SNP have adopted what I would say is a much more socialist response to this. Indeed, I think Nicola Sturgeon is talking in terms of love and solidarity, which are hardly words that I would be using to address the British public. It is absolutely clear to me that we are in extraordinary circumstances, and Conservative governments in previous times where there have been extraordinary circumstances have had to do these things too. Churchill, with a predominantly Conservative made-up national government in the 40s, obviously had to do things which he would never have done in peacetime. Likewise, the Prime Minister is forced here into doing things which are deeply distasteful in any ordinary circumstance.
Are you worried about your Prime Minister? Do you think he's got his mojo, or has he lost it?
I think Bojo has got his mojo back, actually. I've just been talking about this with colleagues, that I think this week we've seen much more the Prime Minister that we know and love. I think his tone has been really good. I think the substance of the announcements has been welcome. And just in himself, it struck me, both in the House and in his speech to the country, that actually it was the Boris that really does connect and resonate. And I hope, as we all do, that this is a sign that his physical health is returning to absolutely 100%, which is what we need. And
do you think he'll stand down after Brexit is done, like some people say in Westminster?
I don't believe that. And I certainly very much hope that's not the case. I mean, I supported Boris's leadership bid last year, precisely because I recognised that he was a politician who can reach out to parts of the country that so very few others can. He is a unique communicator and he is an extraordinary galvanising force. And when I had him in my constituency prior to the election last winter, the response that he generates from people who do not do politics, quote unquote, is just...
But the problem is he can't be Boris. I mean, some say he's lost his script writers. So he's lost the people who made him Boris when he was London mayor, and now he's kind of trapped by the office. He hasn't got the same people around him who know him, who can give him the opportunity to be Boris, to sort of hang from a zip wire waving flags, or can do something else which makes the country laugh. He's lost that, and maybe that's because of the weight of office or the severity and seriousness of COVID-19. But don't you think he's not being Boris anymore, and that's part of the problem?
No, I think the essence of Boris is very much still there, and these are very grave circumstances, and it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for too many light touches at a moment like this, when clearly we are grappling with economic and personal loss on a scale which no one's seen in modern times. I believe that the agenda that Boris has set out transcends the events of this year. It actually transcends Brexit itself. It's about the country that we build on the other side of this. And there is no question that in communities like mine on Teesside, that message around levelling up, around making the Northern Powerhouse a reality, around making sure that Britain as an independent country is so much stronger, is really important.
But Simon,
and powerful.
how do you pay for that? I mean, levelling up is a zero-sum game. If you're going to level up the North East and Teesside by spending more money on schools, hospitals, transport links, you've got to take the money from somewhere else, and that'll be the South, that'll be the middle classes, that'll be the core Tory vote.
Well, I think it's really important that we remember that we are a one-nation government. And actually, on lots of metrics, the North has had a pretty raw deal for a long time. I know per capita spending in an area like Middlesbrough is comparatively high, but the disparity in life chances is really stark. When I arrive in King's Cross on a Monday, London at times feels like a different country. It is just so much more obviously affluent and successful. And even down to things like the education system, you look at school performance in London and the South East by comparison to areas like the North East. There are major structural problems with the balance of opportunity and success within the UK. And I'll never stop arguing for the chance to try and narrow that gap. I do believe clearly that we're in a more expansionary fiscal mindset even before COVID. And that will mean that we govern in a slightly different way. And I welcome that within reasonable boundaries. I think it means that the Tory party is changing. I think if you look at the base of our voters, at the last election, the Conservative Party actually had the lowest median per capita income of its supporters of all three main parties. It was the Liberals, then Labour, and then us. And that is a stark reflection on how much Brexit and Boris have changed the terms of the debate. Affluent Islington can vote for socialism, but I tell you what, Middlesbrough can't.
Simon Clarke, thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Now, to round off this podcast about appealing to the middle ground and dealing with these newly won Red Wall voters for the Tories, with me now is Deborah Mattinson, author of Beyond the Red Wall, whose book looked at just that. Deborah Mattinson, welcome to Choppers Politics. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, very well.
The last time you were on, it was called Choppers Brexit Podcast, this podcast, wasn't it? And now it's called Choppers Politics, because like you, we've reappraised the world post the December election.
We've moved on. And even Ed Davey, who's also on this podcast, has moved on. But your new book is called Beyond the Red Wall. Now, in a nutshell, what's it about and how did you write it? So, in a nutshell, it is about those Red Wall voters who have been, in some ways, ignored by the political establishment for quite a long time, who suddenly woke up kind of blinking the morning after the election in December and found themselves centre stage because, against all the odds, really, those seats, many of which had been Labour seats forever, Bishop Auckland since 1918, Bassetlaw since 1935, Lee since 1922,
had gone Tory. And I wanted to find out what had gone on there. I wanted to find out what had made those lifelong Labour voters switch to Conservative for the first time. And so what I did was to choose 3 constituencies that for me represented different things that were going on there. So I had Hyndburn, which is in Lancashire. The biggest town is Accrington. Darlington, which is a bit more of a weather vane seat. It has been Tory more recently, but nonetheless tends to go with the kind of big swing. And also Stoke Central. And in those places, I really just wanted to get the mood of those voters. And I spent quite a lot of time there. I did focus groups. I did what we call ethnographic interviews, where I sort of went into people's homes and hung out with them for a bit and found out what they cared about and what their lives were like. And yeah, then I've written it all up.
And what really comes across in the book is how these places come alive in the different chapters. For example, when you went to Hyndburn, you talked about Accrington being the biggest place, Aki as it's known locally.
Yes.
And how someone's child went to live in Manchester, and that could have been like going to Australia, given how far away it was, and how the real sense of place and the pride in that place is what we don't really see, do we, from the telescope of London?
Yes, I mean, it's really interesting because the 3 places that I chose were all, in a way, very different with their own character. But what they had in common was this sense of isolation from the rest of the country. You know, lots of people I spoke to had never been to London, or if they had, they'd been for a weekend sightseeing with their kids. You know, and often they rarely went to the nearest big city. And the Manchester example that you quote is great. And it also makes sense because Accrington is 20 odd miles from Manchester, but it takes nearly an hour and a half on the train. So, you know, it's a big commitment if you want to go there. So there were lots of themes that came through that were very consistent across those places. And that feeling of isolation was definitely one of them.
Yeah, and that's where this levelling up agenda comes from, of course, which is what Boris Johnson is talking about. So just going quickly through the main parties, Deborah Mattinson, what do you think is the lesson from your book for Labour, the lessons of Labour?
So I think, first of all, Labour has to kind of really understand why they lost. And they lost because what a lot of people commented on was the deterioration of their local community, their local high street, the fact that there's nowhere to go in the evening, the fact there's nothing for kids to do, there are no jobs. It often felt a bit hopeless. And that happened on Labour's watch, in their view. Their feeling was that Labour had taken those seats for granted and ignored them, often parachuting in politicians who were sort of favoured sons, who were appointed to be MPs and then looked to Westminster and never looked back. There's also a sense that the Labour Party has grown away from these voters, and this has been happening for a long time. So Labour is seen a bit as rather snooty graduates from London who look down on those people and look down on the things that they care about. And that's where Brexit came in, because that was quite an important story. You know, 2/3 of people in those red wall seats voted Leave. But I found even the people that had voted Remain had just wanted it to be over. They wanted it to finish and they wanted to be able to move on. And the Tories offered that opportunity. Labour didn't seem to. The other thing that I think has been incredibly important is how patriotic a lot of the people in the Red Wall are. So, you know, they're very connected to their local community, but they're not very connected, as I've said, to their nearby city. However, they are very, very in love with the country. And, you know, my conclusion in a sense was, you know, if you don't love your country, the Red Wallers will never love you. And that was another big, big lesson for Labour.
And a big lesson for Jeremy Corbyn with questions about his own patriotism.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Corbyn, you know, this wasn't Corbyn's fault. I have to say this had been coming for a long time, but he, in a sense, he sort of turbocharged all of those problems. It definitely did not help to have him as leader.
And then this week, of course, we have Keir Starmer wrapping himself in Union Jack in his virtual conference speech. And you can see why he's trying to learn the lessons that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
What can the Tories do apart from deliver Brexit properly?
Well, certainly they do need to deliver Brexit, and that's really clear. And in fact, I went back to some of the people I interviewed earlier in the year as we were in the sort of COVID phase through the summer. And I said to them, given the coronavirus, is getting Brexit done still such a priority? And they were absolutely unequivocal. Yes, it is. Stick to those Brexit promises. They would be really disappointed. One person, there was a chap called Ian, who was a plumber from Accrington. He said, we just have to get on with it now. We've got to start making our own way in the world. So that really matters. But there are some other things too. I would say expectations are high. There's this whole thing of managing the economy fairly. And that means the north-south divide. It means the levelling up agenda, although people don't really talk about levelling up. They talk about the north-south divide. They want resources to be taken from the south and placed in their constituencies. So it's a slightly different philosophy, same outcome, I guess, but slightly different belief in how that can come about. They really want that to happen.
And the big test will be if it still takes an hour and a half to get from Accrington to Greater Manchester, only 20 miles away. If that changes by the next election, the Tories may have learnt your lesson.
Yes, it will be failure if it doesn't, for sure, because that local infrastructure really mattered to people.
Deborah Mattinson, thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. How can listeners get hold of your book?
Well, you can buy it directly from the publishers, Bike Back. You can get it on Amazon and, as they say, all good booksellers.
Deborah, thank you so much. All the best.
Pleasure.
Don't forget, if you're all caught up on the podcast and twiddling your thumbs, you can read all of our political news and analysis, plus our sport, lifestyle, culture, and much, much more, completely free of charge for 1 month by signing up at telegraph.co.uk/chopper. While you're there, you won't want to miss a piece I wrote for the Telegraph this week about the plans for a traffic light local lockdown scheme across England. That's how it's going to look and how we avoid a national lockdown. We'll put a link to that in the episode description. Huge thanks to Wallerbrook and Danny Kay, who left us reviews on Apple Podcasts this week. And if you enjoyed this show, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show and actually bumps us up the Apple Podcast lists. If you want to be a guest, or if you want to suggest us a good guest, or even just say hello, please email us chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk or follow us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. Thank you to my guests this week, Sir Ed Davey, Simon Clarke and Deborah Mattinson. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. Without you listening, we wouldn't be here. And finally, always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. It's great value. Until next time, cheerio!